The sound of dirt being shoveled onto a pine coffin echoed across the windswept cemetery as Elizabeth Norwood stared at the grave of her husband, Thomas. The late October wind of 1885 swept across the barren hills surrounding Silver Reef, Utah Territory, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of an early winter. Elizabeth clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her knuckles white from the strain of holding herself together. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Norwood," Reverend Porter said, placing a sympathetic hand on her shoulder. "Thomas was a good man with big dreams." Elizabeth nodded silently, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. Good man. Big dreams. That was the kindest way to describe her late husband's reckless ambition that had left her with nothing but a struggling ranch and a mountain of debt. If there's anything the church can do. The Reverend added, his voice trailing off as they both knew there was little the small community church could offer beyond prayers. "Thank you, Reverend," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The other mourners, what few had come, were already dispersing, heading back to town, back to their lives. Only Elizabeth remained, watching as the two gravediggers finished their solemn work. Thomas had been gone just 3 days, taken by a fever that had swept through him with terrifying speed. 3 days since she discovered the stack of unpaid bills and loan notices hidden in his desk drawer. 3 days since she'd learned that the ranch she thought was thriving was actually teetering on the edge of foreclosure. "Madam," one of the gravediggers approached, hat in hand. "We're finished now. Can we walk you back to town?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, thank you, I have my wagon." She gestured to the small buckboard at the edge of the cemetery. "I appreciate your care with my husband." The men nodded respectfully and departed, leaving Elizabeth truly alone with the fresh mound of earth that represented the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. "What am I supposed to do now, Thomas?" she whispered, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. At 26, she was a widow with no family to turn to, no money to speak of, and a ranch that required more work than one woman could possibly manage. The wind picked up, sending dust swirling around her skirts as if in answer. Elizabeth wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and turned toward her wagon. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same determination that had brought her west from Philadelphia 5 years ago as a young bride full of hope and courage. The ride back to the ranch was slow, each turn of the wheels bringing her closer to a future she couldn't envision. As the small, weather-beaten ranch house came into view, Elizabeth noticed a horse tied up outside that she didn't recognize, a tall chestnut with a white blaze down its face. Pulling the wagon to a stop, she sat motionless for a moment, gathering her strength for whatever new challenge awaited. A tall figure emerged from the shadow of the porch, and Elizabeth recognized Samuel Dawson, one of the neighboring ranchers whose land bordered hers to the north. "Mrs. Norwood," he called, stepping forward to help her down from the wagon. "I hope you don't mind me waiting for you here." Elizabeth took his offered hand and stepped down, noticing the strength in his calloused grip. Samuel Dawson was something of a mystery in Silver Reef, a man who kept to himself, running his cattle ranch with quiet efficiency. In her 5 years here, she'd exchanged no more than a dozen sentences with him, usually at town gatherings or passing on the road to town. "Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged, smoothing her black mourning dress. "What brings you here today of all days?" Samuel removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by years under the harsh western sun. His eyes, a clear blue that reminded Elizabeth of mountain lakes, held a mixture of sympathy and something else she couldn't quite name. "I came to pay my respects," he said simply, "and to make you an offer." Elizabeth felt a flash of anger. "I've barely laid my husband to rest, Mr. Dawson. If you're here to buy my land at a discount because you think I'm desperate, that's not it at all, madam," he interrupted, his voice remaining calm. "I know about the debts." Elizabeth stiffened. "How could you possibly? Everyone knows, Mrs. Norwood." In a town this small, there are few secrets. Thomas borrowed from half the businesses in Silver Reef. The bank's been talking about foreclosure for weeks. The blunt assessment of her situation struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. She'd known things were bad, but hearing it stated so plainly by this near stranger made it unbearably real. "Then you are here to take advantage," she said coldly. Samuel shook his head. "No, madam, I'm here to offer help." He gestured toward the ranch house and the fields beyond. "This land has good water rights, the soil's rich in the valley. Thomas had the right idea, just the wrong approach." "And what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Dawson?" Elizabeth asked, crossing her arms defensively. "A partnership," he said simply. "I've got the men and resources to make this place work again. You've got the land. Together we could build something worth keeping." Elizabeth stared at him, trying to detect any hint of deception or ulterior motive in his steady gaze. "Why would you do that? You don't know me, Mr. Dawson." "You barely knew my husband." "I know what it's like to face impossible odds alone," he replied, something flickering behind his eyes that spoke of personal experience. "And I believe in this land. I've watched what you and Thomas were trying to build here. With the right help, this ranch could be something special." The wind picked up again, sending a tumbleweed skittering across the yard between them. Elizabeth shivered, though whether from cold or the weight of the decision before her, she couldn't say. "I need time to think, Mr. Dawson." Samuel nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Of course, I'll come by in 3 days' time for your answer." He turned toward his horse, then paused. "Mrs. Norwood, I know this seems sudden and strange, but winter's coming and decisions get harder when the snow falls." With that, he mounted his horse in one fluid motion, the movement of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. Elizabeth watched as he rode away, his straight-backed silhouette gradually disappearing against the backdrop of the distant mountains. Inside the small ranch house, everything reminded Elizabeth of Thomas, his boots by the door, his favorite chair by the fireplace, the smell of his tobacco lingering in the curtains. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now seemed to belong to another life entirely. At Thomas's desk, she once again faced the pile of papers that had shattered her world: notices from the bank, unpaid bills from the mercantile, loans from private individuals she'd never even heard of. Thomas had apparently been borrowing money from anyone who would lend it, using the funds to buy more land, more cattle, more equipment, all in pursuit of his dream of building the biggest ranch in the county. Now that dream lay buried with him, leaving Elizabeth with the wreckage of his ambitions. She sat heavily in the chair, running her fingers over a half-written letter in Thomas's bold handwriting. Another request for funds, this one to a banker in Salt Lake City. The words blurred as fresh tears filled her eyes. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, "what were you thinking?" The silence of the house offered no answers. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky as Elizabeth lit a lamp and continued sorting through the papers. By midnight, she had a clearer picture of her situation, and it was dire. Without an influx of cash before winter, she would lose everything: the ranch, the house, even the few personal possessions she'd brought from Philadelphia. Exhausted, she finally retired to bed, though sleep proved elusive. Samuel Dawson's offer circled in her mind: a partnership. Something worth keeping. It seemed too good to be true, which in Elizabeth's experience usually meant it was. Yet what choice did she have? The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the browning grass outside her window. Elizabeth dressed quickly and made a simple breakfast of coffee and leftover biscuits. She had decisions to make, and sitting alone in the house wasn't going to help. Hitching up her wagon, she drove into Silver Reef, a town that had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the sandstone reefs nearby. Unlike many mining towns that blazed bright and died quickly, Silver Reef had established itself with solid brick buildings and a sense of permanence, even as the mines began producing less each year. Elizabeth's first stop was the bank, where she steeled herself to face Harold Jennings, the bank manager who had repeatedly warned Thomas about overextending himself. "Mrs. Norwood," Jennings greeted her, rising from behind his desk as she entered his office. His sympathetic expression did little to mask the calculation in his eyes. "Please accept my condolences on your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Jennings," Elizabeth replied, taking the offered seat. "I've come to discuss the loans." Jennings nodded, pulling a thick folder from a drawer. I assumed as much. I'm afraid your husband left you in a difficult position, Mrs. Norwood. I'm aware of that, Elizabeth said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'd like to know exactly how difficult. For the next hour, Jennings walked her through the details of Thomas's financial arrangements with the bank, the initial mortgage, the subsequent loans, the missed payments, and finally, the foreclosure notice that had been prepared but not yet delivered out of respect for her bereavement. So I have until the end of November, Elizabeth summarized, to pay at least half of what's owed or you'll take the property. I'm afraid that's correct, Jennings confirmed, looking genuinely regretful. If there was any way to extend the deadline further, Mr. Dawson came to see me yesterday, Elizabeth interrupted. He proposed a partnership to save the ranch. Jennings raised his eyebrows. Samuel Dawson, that's unexpected. Why do you say that? Mr. Dawson keeps to himself. Has done ever since he arrived 8 years ago. He runs a tight operation, pays his debts on time, but doesn't involve himself in town affairs or others' business. Jennings leaned forward slightly. Did he explain what kind of partnership he was proposing? Not in detail, Elizabeth admitted. Just that he has the resources to make the ranch work and I have the land. Jennings nodded thoughtfully. From a financial perspective, it could be a solution. Dawson's ranch is prosperous and his word is good. If he were to co-sign on your loans, the bank would certainly be more accommodating about repayment terms. Elizabeth left the bank with a slightly lighter heart, though still filled with uncertainty. Her next stop was the Mercantile, where she faced Martha Wilson, the sharp-tongued owner who had extended Thomas credit far longer than was prudent. Well, if it isn't the widow Norwood, Martha greeted her, hands on ample hips. Come to settle accounts. I've come to ask for patience, Mrs. Wilson, Elizabeth replied, refusing to be intimidated. I'm exploring options to save the ranch and pay what Thomas owed. Martha's expression softened slightly. You always were the sensible one of the pair. What options might those be? Elizabeth hesitated, then decided honesty was her best approach. Samuel Dawson has offered a partnership. If I accept, I believe all debts could be paid in time. Martha's eyebrows shot up. Dawson, well, a smile spread across her face. That changes things. You tell Samuel Dawson that Martha Wilson can wait for her money if he's involved. By midday, Elizabeth had visited every creditor in town with similar results. The mere mention of Dawson's name had opened doors and bought time. It was clear that while Samuel Dawson might keep to himself, his reputation for integrity and business acumen was well established in Silver Reef. Her last stop was the land office, where she reviewed the property records for both her ranch and Dawson's. What she discovered was illuminating. The Dawson ranch was indeed prosperous, nearly 3 times the size of her own, with prime grazing land and water rights. More interesting, however, was the fact that Dawson had purchased his land in increments over the years, building slowly and methodically rather than overreaching as Thomas had done. As she drove back to the ranch, Elizabeth pondered what she had learned. Samuel Dawson was clearly respected in the community, financially sound and apparently sincere in his offer of help. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why? What did he stand to gain by helping her? The answer, she suspected, lay in the land itself. Together, their 2 ranches would control the entire northern valley, including the best water access for miles around. It was a smart business move, but was that all it was? Elizabeth arrived home to find a bundle on her porch, a basket covered with a cloth. Inside were fresh bread, preserves, smoked meat, and a small sack of coffee beans. A note written in a neat, strong hand read simply, "Thought you might need these. SD." The unexpected kindness brought tears to her eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had thought about what she might need. That evening, as she sat by the fire with a cup of coffee made from Dawson's beans, Elizabeth made her decision. When Samuel Dawson returned in 2 days' time, she would accept his offer of partnership with conditions. She wouldn't surrender control of her land or her life to anyone, not even a man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. If they were to build something together, it would be as equals. The next day dawned with an unexpected challenge. Elizabeth woke to the sound of distress lowing from the barn. Pulling on her robe, she hurried outside to find one of her remaining milk cows in labor, but clearly struggling. "Easy, Bessie," she murmured, approaching the distressed animal. Elizabeth had assisted with birthing before, but always with Thomas's help. Now she would have to manage alone. The calf was breech. Its back legs presented first a dangerous position that could mean death for both mother and baby without intervention. Elizabeth rolled up her sleeves and set to work, trying to remember everything she'd seen Thomas do in similar situations. For 2 hours she struggled, her arms deep inside the cow, trying to turn the calf while Bessie groaned and strained. Elizabeth's muscles screamed with effort, sweat pouring down her face despite the morning chill. "Come on, little one," she urged, finally managing to get a rope around the calf's back legs. "Your mama needs you to come out now." With one final, tremendous pull, the calf slid free in a rush of fluid. It lay motionless on the straw, and Elizabeth's heart sank. After all that effort, to lose the calf would be a cruel blow. Acting on instinct, she cleared the mucus from the calf's nose and mouth, then began rubbing its chest vigorously. "Breathe," she commanded. "Breathe, damn you." As if in response to her demand, the calf gave a shuddering gasp and then a weak moo. Elizabeth laughed in relief, continuing to rub the newborn dry with handfuls of straw. Bessie turned her head to inspect her offspring, beginning to lick the calf clean with long sweeps of her tongue. It was a bull calf, strong despite his difficult entry into the world. "You're a fighter," Elizabeth told the wobbly creature as it struggled to stand on spindly legs. "We're going to need that spirit around here." By the time she had cleaned up and changed her clothes, the sun was high in the sky. Elizabeth was bone-weary, but filled with a sense of accomplishment that had been absent for too long. She had saved the cow and calf without help, a small victory, but hers alone. The rest of the day was spent in practical tasks, mending fences in the small corral, taking inventory of the feed stores for winter, and continuing to sort through Thomas's papers. By nightfall, she had a clearer picture of both the challenges and opportunities the ranch presented. The next morning, the day Samuel Dawson was due to return, Elizabeth woke before dawn. She dressed with particular care, choosing a simple blue dress that was practical but becoming. It wasn't vanity that motivated her choice, she told herself, but the need to present herself as capable and composed for the business discussion ahead. She spent the morning baking bread and preparing a stew, reasoning that offering a meal was simple hospitality, not an attempt to impress her potential business partner. By noon, the house was filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread and simmering meat. Samuel Dawson arrived precisely at the agreed-upon time, riding up to the house with the same quiet confidence he had shown during their previous meeting. Elizabeth watched from the window as he dismounted, noting the fluid grace of his movements and the way he took a moment to survey the ranch before approaching the house. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Dawson," she greeted him, proud of the steadiness in her voice. "Thank you for coming." Samuel removed his hat, revealing that same sun-streaked brown hair. "Mrs. Norwood," he replied with a slight nod. "I hope these past days have brought you some clarity." "They have," Elizabeth confirmed, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in. I've prepared some lunch if you're hungry." A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "That's very kind of you, madam." Inside, Samuel took the seat she offered at the kitchen table, his tall frame making the simple wooden chair seem almost too small. Elizabeth served the stew and fresh bread, then sat across from him, determined to maintain a businesslike atmosphere despite the domestic setting. "I've considered your offer of partnership," she began, watching as he broke a piece of bread. "And I've spoken with people in town about you." Samuel paused, a spoonful of stew halfway to his mouth. "Have you now?" he asked, amusement evident in his tone. "And what did the good people of Silver Reef have to say? That you're a man of your word, that you pay your debts and mind your own business?" Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "That you've never shown interest in expanding your holdings or involving yourself in others' affairs until now." Samuel set his spoon down. "You're wondering why I'm offering to help you. It's the logical question," he nodded, acknowledging the point. "Your land and mine together would control the whole northern valley, From a purely practical standpoint, it makes sense. So this is just business, Elizabeth pressed, surprised by the hint of disappointment she felt. No, Samuel said after a moment's consideration, not just business. He seemed to struggle with his next words. I admired the way you stood by Thomas, even when his decisions weren't always sound. I've watched you work alongside him, building something from nothing. That kind of determination deserves a chance to succeed. The simple honesty in his voice touched Elizabeth more deeply than flowery sentiment would have. Thank you for the food you sent, she said, changing the subject slightly. It was very thoughtful. It seemed the practical thing to do, Samuel replied, returning to his meal. Have you made a decision about my offer? Elizabeth nodded. I'm willing to enter into a partnership, Mr. Dawson, but I have conditions. I'd expect nothing less, he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. What are they? First, I retain ownership of the land itself. No matter what happens, the deed stays in my name. Elizabeth watched his reaction carefully, but his expression remained neutral. Second, I want to be a true partner not just in name, but in decision-making and daily operations. I won't be a silent bystander on my own ranch. Samuel considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Any other terms? Yes, this partnership is strictly business. I'm still in mourning for my husband, and I have no interest in the town gossips speculating about anything beyond our professional arrangement. At this, Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly. I assure you, Mrs. Norwood, my intentions are honorable. I hadn't considered people will talk regardless of intentions, Mr. Dawson. I simply want to be clear from the outset. Very clear, he agreed, a hint of amusement returning to his eyes. Is that all? For now, Elizabeth said. I'll have my own conditions put in writing by the lawyer in town. Thorough and cautious, Samuel observed. Good qualities in a business partner. He finished his stew and set the spoon down with a decisive click against the bowl. Now, if we're to be partners, there are some things you should know about my operation and how I suggest we proceed. For the next 2 hours, they discussed practical matters which if Samuel's men could help with the immediate work needed on Elizabeth's ranch, how to manage the remaining cattle through the winter, and what crops might be planted in spring to maximize profits. Samuel proved to be knowledgeable without being condescending, listening to Elizabeth's ideas with genuine interest. One thing I don't understand, Elizabeth said as they reviewed a rough map of the combined properties, is why Thomas struggled so much when you've been successful with similar land. Samuel was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Your husband had big visions, Mrs. Norwood. He wanted to create something grand all at once. There's nobility in that kind of dream, but ranching doesn't work that way. It's built season by season, one good decision after another. He traced a finger along the creek that ran through both their properties. Thomas borrowed to buy more cattle than the land could support in a dry year. He planted crops that looked profitable on paper but weren't suited to this soil. He was always reaching for tomorrow instead of building on today. The assessment was painfully accurate, and Elizabeth felt a fresh wave of grief for her husband's misplaced optimism. And you, she asked softly, what's your approach? I believe in building something that lasts, Samuel replied, his voice equally quiet. Something worth keeping. The phrase echoed his words from their first meeting, and Elizabeth found herself studying his face more closely. Samuel Dawson was not what most would call handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too weathered, his expression too serious, but there was a steadiness to him that she found increasingly compelling. It's getting late, she said abruptly, rising from the table. When will you bring your men to start the work? If Samuel noticed her sudden shift in demeanor, he gave no sign. Tomorrow, if that suits you, we'll start with the essential repairs before winter sets in. That would be fine, Mr. Dawson. Samuel, he corrected gently. If we're to be partners, we should at least use first names. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. Samuel, then, and you may call me Elizabeth. Elizabeth, he repeated, and something in the way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her. Until tomorrow. After he had gone, Elizabeth stood on the porch watching the dust from his horse's hooves settle on the road. She had made her decision and set her course. Now she could only hope it was the right one. True to his word, Samuel arrived the next morning with 3 men, a weathered older cowhand introduced as Hank, a young Mexican vaquero named Miguel, and a taciturn man of indeterminate age called simply Doc, though he claimed no medical training. "Best men I've got," Samuel told Elizabeth as they unloaded tools from a wagon. "They'll help get the place ready for winter while still tending to my herd." The men set to work immediately, replacing broken fence posts, patching the barn roof, and clearing irrigation ditches with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. Elizabeth worked alongside them, ignoring their initial surprise at seeing a woman handling an axe or hauling lumber. By mid-afternoon, more had been accomplished than Elizabeth had managed in the week since Thomas's death. She paused to wipe sweat from her brow, watching as Samuel expertly repaired the windmill that had been broken for months. "Your men work well," she observed when he climbed down. "They respect you. They're good men," Samuel replied simply. "Loyal, and rare in these parts, I'd imagine. Most cowhands drift from ranch to ranch," Samuel nodded. "They stay because I treat them fairly and give them a stake in the success of the place. Hank's been with me from the beginning." Doc came 2 years later. "Miguel joined us 3 summers ago." "A stake?" Elizabeth asked, curious. "They each get a small percentage of the profits beyond their wages, gives them reason to care about more than just drawing pay." The concept was foreign to Elizabeth. Thomas had always hired hands seasonally, paying the going rate but nothing more. Yet another difference in approach between the 2 men. As the days passed, Elizabeth found herself increasingly comfortable with the new arrangement. Samuel was a man of routine, arriving each morning at the same time, working steadily through the day, and departing as the sun began to set. He never presumed to take over, always consulting Elizabeth on decisions affecting her property, and he showed genuine interest in her ideas. One evening, as they sat on the porch reviewing the day's progress, Elizabeth found the courage to ask about his past. "You mentioned knowing what it's like to face impossible odds," she reminded him. "What did you mean?" Samuel was silent so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I came west from Tennessee after the war, had nothing but the clothes on my back and a horse that was more bones than flesh." He looked out at the darkening landscape. "Worked cattle drives, mining camps, anything that would pay, saved every penny. When I had enough, I bought my first piece of land not much bigger than your front yard, built from there." "Alone?" Elizabeth asked. A shadow passed over his face. "Not at first. I had a wife, Caroline. She died in childbirth our 2nd year here, the baby too." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said softly, understanding now the source of his empathy for her situation. Samuel nodded, accepting her sympathy without further comment. "After that, I focused on the land. It doesn't replace what's lost, but it gives purpose." The simple statement resonated deeply with Elizabeth. In the weeks since Thomas's death, she had been searching for exactly that purpose beyond mere survival. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Samuel turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. Partners should know each other's stories. The work continued as October gave way to November. True to Samuel's prediction, the first snow fell early, dusting the hills with white. Elizabeth found herself watching for his arrival each morning, missing his steady presence on Sundays when he stayed away out of respect for her stated boundaries. In town, she noticed people treating her differently with more respect and less pity. The partnership with Samuel had changed her standing, giving her a future beyond the role of impoverished widow. The bank had extended her loans based on Samuel's co-signature, and even Martha Wilson at the Mercantile had begun extending credit again. "That Samuel Dawson's a good man," Martha commented one day as Elizabeth purchased supplies. "Not one for socializing, but solid as they come." "He's been very helpful," Elizabeth agreed neutrally. Martha's shrewd eyes assessed her. "Just helpful, is it?" Half the town's wondering when the partnership might become more permanent. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Dawson and I have a business arrangement, nothing more, if you say so, dear," Martha replied, clearly unconvinced, "though I can't imagine why not. You're both free, of suitable age, and from what I hear, getting along splendidly." The conversation left Elizabeth unsettled. She had been so focused on saving the ranch that she hadn't allowed herself to consider any personal aspect to her relationship with Samuel. Yet she couldn't deny that she had come to look forward to their daily interactions, the quiet conversations, the shared sense of accomplishment, the occasional glimpse of humor behind his serious demeanor. But it was too soon, wasn't it? Thomas had been gone barely a month. Proper mourning should last at least a year. The idea of developing feelings for another man so quickly seemed disloyal to his memory. Yet as November progressed, Elizabeth found it increasingly difficult to maintain emotional distance from Samuel. The day he arrived with a small stack of books learning, she enjoyed reading, but had few volumes of her own. She felt something shift inside her, a recognition that his thoughtfulness went beyond mere partnership. The books were well chosen: a volume of poetry by Wordsworth, a novel by Jane Austen, and a practical guide to Western botany that identified local plants and their uses. "I thought you might enjoy these during the winter evenings," Samuel said, almost shyly. "My shelves are full of books I've collected over the years. These are just a few I thought you might like." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the leather binding of the poetry book. "This is very kind, Samuel. I love to read, but I had to leave most of my books behind when we moved west. There's not much to do during the winter nights except read or whittle, and I've never had the patience for carving," Samuel admitted with a small smile. Would you like to stay for supper?" Elizabeth asked impulsively. As thanks for the books, a warmth lit Samuel's eyes. "I'd be honored." That evening marked a subtle change in their relationship. Over a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, they spoke not of ranch business but of books they had read, places they had seen, and the circuitous paths that had led them both to Silver Reef. Samuel proved to be well-read despite his lack of formal education, with thoughtful opinions on everything from Shakespeare to modern agricultural techniques. Elizabeth found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn out of her grief by his quiet wit and genuine interest in her thoughts. As he prepared to leave, standing in the doorway with hat in hand, Samuel hesitated. "I've enjoyed this evening, Elizabeth." "As have I," she admitted, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the narrow doorway. Perhaps we might do this again sometime." Elizabeth knew she should refuse, maintain the professional boundaries she herself had established. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd like that." The smile that transformed Samuel's usually serious face made her heart beat faster. "Good night, then," he said softly. "Good night, Samuel." After he had gone, Elizabeth sat by the fire with one of his books, but found herself reading the same page repeatedly as her thoughts kept returning to the evening's conversation. It was undeniable now she was developing feelings for Samuel Dawson that went well beyond appreciation for his help or respect for his abilities. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. To open her heart again so soon after losing Thomas seemed reckless. Yet the connection she felt with Samuel was different from what she had shared with her husband, less passionate perhaps, but deeper in some indefinable way. As November turned to December, the partnership continued to thrive on both professional and personal levels. Samuel now stayed for supper several times a week, and their conversations ranged from practical ranch matters to philosophical discussions that often lasted late into the evening. The ranch itself was being transformed under their joint efforts. The fences were repaired, the barn made sound for winter, and plans laid for spring planting. Samuel had brought over some of his healthier cattle to supplement Elizabeth's diminished herd, marking them with a combined brand they had designed together. In town, the partnership was now viewed as an established success, with several other struggling ranchers inquiring about similar arrangements. Elizabeth found herself consulted on matters beyond her own property, her opinion sought and valued in a way it had never been during Thomas's lifetime. Yet beneath the external success, she struggled with conflicting emotions, growing affection for Samuel warring with loyalty to Thomas's memory. The fact that she hadn't loved Thomas as deeply as she once believed only complicated her feelings further. The truth, which she could now admit to herself in the quiet of night, was that her marriage had been based more on gratitude and admiration than passionate love. Thomas had offered escape from a restrictive life in Philadelphia, adventure in the untamed West, and she had mistaken her excitement for true love. Did she risk making the same mistake with Samuel? Or was what she felt for him something more genuine, a connection built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than romantic idealization? The answer came on a snowy evening in mid-December. Samuel had stayed late, discussing plans for expanding the irrigation system in spring, when a blizzard blew in suddenly from the north. The wind howled around the small house, driving snow against the windows with frightening force. "You can't ride home in this," Elizabeth said, peering out at the white fury that had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. "I've ridden in worse," Samuel replied, though he too looked concerned as he assessed the storm. "Don't be foolish," she insisted. "Even if you could find your way, your horse might break a leg in a hidden drift. You'll have to stay until it passes." The practical logic of her argument was irrefutable, yet the implication hung between them. Samuel would have to spend the night under her roof, something they had both carefully avoided despite their growing closeness. "I can sleep in the barn," he offered. Elizabeth shook her head. "You'd freeze." "The barn isn't insulated like the house." She squared her shoulders, making a decision. "You can take Thomas's room. I've been sleeping in the small bedroom since he died." Samuel studied her face for a long moment. "If you're certain it wouldn't be inappropriate." "I think survival takes precedence over propriety," Elizabeth said with a slight smile. "Besides, who's to know out here?" The blizzard continued through the night, the wind battering the house like a living thing seeking entry. Elizabeth lay awake in her small bed, acutely aware of Samuel's presence down the hall in what had been her marital bedroom. The situation stirred complicated emotions: guilt at the inappropriate thoughts that kept intruding, relief at not being alone during the frightening storm, and a growing certainty that what she felt for Samuel was genuine and enduring. Morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow that covered the landscape in smooth, rolling drifts. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world of dazzling white. Elizabeth rose early, building up the fire and starting breakfast before Samuel emerged from the bedroom, his hair rumpled from sleep. "Good morning," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It seems the storm has passed." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, busying herself with the coffee pot. "You should be able to ride back once we've cleared a path to the barn." They ate breakfast in uncharacteristic silence, the intimate domesticity of the situation creating a tension that hadn't existed before. As Samuel helped her clear the dishes, their hands brushed, and Elizabeth felt a jolt of awareness that made her step back abruptly. "Elizabeth," Samuel said quietly, "I think we need to talk." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes, I suppose we do." Samuel guided her to sit at the table, then took the chair opposite, his expression serious. "I've developed feelings for you that go beyond our business partnership," he said directly. "I've tried to respect your mourning and keep a proper distance, but after last night, I need to be honest with you." Elizabeth's heart raced at his words, but she forced herself to respond cautiously. "Samuel, it's been barely 2 months since Thomas died. Anything I might feel now could be influenced by gratitude or loneliness or simple confusion." "I understand that," he acknowledged. "And I'm not asking for any commitment from you, I just wanted you to know where I stand." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "I'm willing to wait, Elizabeth, however long you need." The sincerity in his eyes undid her careful restraint. "I have feelings for you too," she admitted softly. "But I'm afraid of making another mistake, of rushing into something before I've properly grieved Thomas or truly know my own heart." Samuel nodded, accepting her honesty with characteristic grace. "Then we continue as we have been, partners in rebuilding this ranch, friends perhaps, and in time, if your feelings remain, we can discuss what comes next." The simple wisdom of his approach calmed Elizabeth's turmoil. "Thank you for understanding. I lost someone too, remember," he reminded her gently. "I know grief doesn't follow a tidy schedule." After clearing a path to the barn and ensuring the animals were fed, Samuel prepared to leave. Standing by his saddled horse, he turned to Elizabeth with a hesitant expression. "There's a Christmas gathering at the church next week," he said. "Would you consider attending with me? As friends," he added quickly. "It might do you good to socialize a bit." Elizabeth considered the invitation. She had been avoiding town gatherings since Thomas's death, but the idea of emerging from her isolation was appealing. "Yes," she decided. "I think I would like that." Samuel's smile warmed her more effectively than the winter sunshine. "I'll come by to collect you at 6 then." As he rode away through the snow, Elizabeth felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since Thomas's death, it held promise rather than just challenge. The Christmas gathering at Silver Reef small church proved to be exactly what Elizabeth needed. The building was festively decorated with pine boughs and candles, the air fragrant with spices from mulled cider and freshly baked treats. Most of the town had turned out, creating a warm contrast to the cold night outside. Elizabeth had taken special care with her appearance, wearing a dark green dress that had been reserved for special occasions and pinning her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangement. The appreciative look in Samuel's eyes when he arrived to escort her confirmed her efforts had been worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "It feels strange to dress up after so many months in black." "Life continues," Samuel observed gently. "Thomas wouldn't have wanted you to mourn forever." The truth of his words struck Elizabeth deeply. Thomas, for all his faults, had been a man who embraced life fully. He would indeed have wanted her to find happiness again, even if that meant with another man, at the church. They were greeted warmly by Reverend Porter and gradually drawn into the festivities. Elizabeth found herself surrounded by neighbors offering genuine good wishes rather than the pity she had come to expect. Many commented on the visible improvements to her ranch, congratulating her on the successful partnership with Samuel. "You two make a fine team," Martha Wilson observed with a knowing smile. In business and otherwise, before Elizabeth could protest, Samuel placed a steadying hand at the small of her back. "We're taking things one day at a time, Mrs. Wilson," he replied diplomatically. "But thank you for your good wishes." The simple touch and calm response diffused what might have been an awkward moment. Elizabeth gave him a grateful look as they moved on to greet others. The evening progressed with carols singing, a reading of the Christmas story by the Reverend, and a community meal that showcased the best cooking Silver Reef had to offer. Throughout it all, Samuel remained attentively at Elizabeth's side, neither possessive nor distant, striking exactly the right note of respectful companionship. It was during the final carol, as the congregation stood singing Silent Night by candlelight, that Elizabeth felt something settle within her. Looking at the faces around her neighbors who had become friends, a community that had supported her through loss, she realized she had found her place in this harsh but beautiful land. And glancing at Samuel, his strong profile illuminated by candlelight as he sang in a surprisingly melodious baritone, she knew she had found something else as well. A second chance at love, unexpected but all the more precious for its surprise. As they drove back to the ranch in Samuel's sleigh, the night sky ablaze with stars, Elizabeth found herself leaning slightly against his solid warmth. "Thank you for convincing me to come tonight," she said. "It was exactly what I needed." "I'm glad," Samuel replied, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "It's good to see you smile again." Elizabeth turned slightly to look at him. "I've been thinking about what you said about waiting until I know my own heart." Samuel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "Yes. I don't think I need to wait any longer," she said softly. "These past months working alongside you, getting to know you, I've come to care for you in a way that feels real and lasting." The sleigh slowed as Samuel turned his full attention to her. "Elizabeth, please let me finish," she interrupted gently. "What I felt for Thomas was real in its way, but it was built on dreams and expectations rather than true understanding. With you, it's different. I see you clearly, your strength and your flaws. And I find I care for the real man, not some idealized version." Samuel brought the sleigh to a complete stop, the horses stamping restlessly in the snow. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Elizabeth nodded, suddenly shy despite her bold words. I'm saying I'm ready to consider a future that includes more than just a business partnership between us. The joy that transformed Samuel's face was worth any risk of speaking too soon. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned toward her. "May I kiss you, Elizabeth?" "Yes," she whispered, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a promise rather than a demand. Elizabeth felt it warm her from within, dispelling the last lingering chill of grief and loneliness. When they parted, Samuel rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his eyes closed as if memorizing the feeling. "I've wanted to do that since the day I brought you those books," he admitted. Elizabeth laughed softly. "I think I wanted you to, even then." The remainder of the drive home was filled with a comfortable silence, their hands entwined beneath the blanket covering their laps. At the ranch house, Samuel helped Elizabeth down from the sleigh but hesitated at the door. "I should go," he said, though his eyes conveyed reluctance. Elizabeth appreciated his restraint. Despite her declaration of feelings, they both knew that rushing matters would only complicate what was still a delicate new beginning. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked, "for Christmas Eve supper?" "I'd like nothing better," Samuel replied, his smile visible even in the darkness. He kissed her once more, a brief touch of lips that held the promise of future kisses, then returned to his sleigh. Elizabeth watched until he disappeared into the night, her heart fuller than it had been in longer than she could remember. Christmas Eve brought a fresh dusting of snow, and a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the holiday itself. Elizabeth spent the day preparing a special meal, using some of the carefully hoarded supplies she had been saving for a special occasion. She made a simple but festive dress from fabric Martha Wilson had given her at a discount, threading red ribbon through the collar and cuffs to mark the holiday. Samuel arrived in the late afternoon, bearing gifts wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, a stark contrast to the elaborate wrapped presents Elizabeth remembered from her childhood in Philadelphia, yet somehow more meaningful in their simplicity. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her, stamping snow from his boots before entering. His cheeks were red from the cold, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Something smells wonderful." "Venison roast," Elizabeth replied, taking his coat. "Miguel brought it yesterday, said he got an extra deer, and thought we might enjoy it for the holiday." "That was thoughtful of him," Samuel observed, following her into the kitchen where the small table had been set with Elizabeth's best china wedding gifts that had rarely been used during Thomas's lifetime. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," he said, noting the festive arrangements. "It's Christmas," Elizabeth replied simply. "And I wanted tonight to be special." Samuel's expression softened. "It already is." The meal was a success, the venison tender and flavorful, accompanied by the last of Elizabeth's preserved vegetables from the previous summer's garden. They talked easily, sharing stories of Christmases past and hopes for the future, the conversation flowing naturally between practical ranch matters and more personal topics. After the meal, they moved to the small sitting area where Elizabeth had decorated a modest pine tree with paper ornaments and candles. Beneath it sat Samuel's wrapped gifts alongside the package Elizabeth had prepared for him. "Ladies first," Samuel said, handing her the larger of his two gifts. Elizabeth unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "It's lovely," she said, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "I thought you might want to record your plans for the ranch," Samuel explained. "Or perhaps write stories of your own someday." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Elizabeth deeply. She had mentioned only once, in passing, her childhood dream of becoming a writer. The second package contained a small silver pendant in the shape of a tree, hanging from a delicate chain. "For new beginnings," Samuel said as he fastened it around her neck, "and for things that grow stronger with time." Elizabeth's hand went to the pendant, feeling its weight against her skin. "It's perfect," she whispered, moved by the symbolism. Her gift to Samuel seemed practical in comparison, a new pair of leather gloves she had commissioned from the saddle maker in town, embossed with the combined brand they had created for their partnership. "These are magnificent," Samuel said, trying them on. "Exactly what I needed." "There's something else," Elizabeth said, suddenly nervous. Though it's not something I can wrap, Samuel looked at her curiously. What is it? Elizabeth took a deep breath. I've been thinking about our partnership, both the business aspect and the personal development. As have I, Samuel acknowledged, his expression turning serious. I believe both would benefit from a more permanent arrangement, Elizabeth continued, choosing her words carefully. The ranch would be more secure with a single ownership structure, and as for the personal aspect. She faltered, finding it harder than expected to put her feelings into words. Samuel moved closer, taking her hands in his. Elizabeth, are you proposing to me? A nervous laugh escaped her. I suppose I am, in my own roundabout way. Is that terribly forward of me? It's perfectly in character, Samuel replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Practical and direct, just as you've been from the start. His expression grew tender. But I'm afraid I can't accept. Elizabeth's heart sank. Had she misread his feelings entirely? Because, Samuel continued, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small box, I had planned to ask you the same question tonight. Relief and joy washed through Elizabeth as Samuel opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small diamond that caught the candlelight and scattered it in tiny rainbows. It was my mother's, he explained. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment, the right person. He slid from his chair to one knee, still holding her hands. Elizabeth Norwood, will you marry me? Will you join our lives completely, building something lasting together? Yes, Elizabeth answered without hesitation. Yes, I will. As Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger, Elizabeth felt the last shadows of doubt lift from her heart. This was right, not too soon, not a betrayal of Thomas's memory, but a new beginning built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine love. Their kiss sealed the promise, no longer hesitant but confident and deep. When they finally parted, Samuel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed in what appeared to be silent prayer of gratitude. When, he asked simply, spring, Elizabeth decided. After the thaw, when the land comes back to life. Samuel nodded, approving of the symbolism, a new beginning in every sense. They spent the remainder of Christmas Eve planning their future, not just their wedding, but the expanded ranch operations, improvements to both houses, and eventually combining their households into one. It was nearly midnight when Samuel reluctantly prepared to leave. I wish you could stay, Elizabeth admitted, standing in the doorway with him. So do I, Samuel replied, his voice husky, but we've waited this long. A few more months won't hurt us. His restraint only increased Elizabeth's certainty that she had chosen wisely. This was a man who valued propriety and reputation not out of prudishness, but from respect for her and the life they would build together. The winter months passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Once their engagement was announced, the community of Silver Reef rallied around them with surprising enthusiasm. The banker, Jennings, restructured Elizabeth's loans into a joint account with more favorable terms. Martha Wilson organized a sewing circle to help Elizabeth prepare household linens and a wedding dress. Even the taciturn Doc revealed hidden carpentry skills, crafting a beautiful headboard for the bed they would eventually share. Samuel spent most days at Elizabeth's ranch, overseeing the continued improvements while teaching her more about cattle management and sustainable farming practices. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk most days, then spent evenings planning their future over simple meals and increasingly passionate embraces. By March, the snow had begun to recede, revealing patches of mud that promised eventual green. The wedding was set for early April, when the worst of the spring mud would have dried, but before the demanding work of planting would begin. Elizabeth had chosen to be married in her own home rather than the church, wanting to begin their marriage in the place they had built together. The ranch house had been transformed in preparation, the walls freshly whitewashed, new curtains hung at the windows, and furniture rearranged to accommodate the small gathering of friends who would witness their vows. The day before the wedding, Elizabeth found herself alone for the first time in weeks. Samuel had returned to his own ranch to prepare for the ceremony, and the house felt strangely empty without his presence. She wandered from room to room, touching objects that would soon be theirs rather than simply hers. In the small study that had been Thomas's domain, she paused, struck by a sudden wave of memory. For a moment, she could almost see him at the desk, hunched over his grand plans, his face alight with dreams that had ultimately proved too ambitious. "I hope you would understand, Thomas," she said softly to the empty room. "I think you would approve of Samuel. He's making your dreams real, just in a different way than you imagined." The silence that answered was peaceful rather than accusatory. Elizabeth felt a sense of closure, of one chapter ending properly before another began. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed as a good omen. Elizabeth dressed in the simple white gown the women of Silver Reef had helped her create, adorned only with Samuel's silver tree pendant and a crown of early wildflowers Martha Wilson had somehow procured. Reverend Porter arrived early, bringing with him a letter that had arrived on the morning stage. "It's from the Territorial Land Office," he explained, handing the official-looking envelope to Elizabeth. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. As she read, tears filled her eyes. "Elizabeth, what is it?" the Reverend asked, concerned. "It's the final approval," she explained, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "Samuel filed paperwork months ago to have our adjoining properties legally recognized as a single ranch. This makes it official." She looked up at the Reverend, smiling through her tears. "He named it Norwood Dawson Ranch instead of just taking my land into his holdings. He's a good man," the Reverend observed. "You've both been blessed to find each other." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful. With Hank, Miguel, Doc, Martha Wilson, and a handful of other friends gathered in the small sitting room, Elizabeth and Samuel exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership, mutual respect, and shared purpose. "I take you as my wife," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "pledging to stand beside you in all endeavors, to value your mind as well as your heart, and to build with you something worth keeping, not just a ranch, but a life of meaning and joy." Elizabeth's response echoed his sentiment. "I take you as my husband, grateful for the strength you've shown me, the purpose you've helped me find, and the future we will create together. What began as necessity has grown into love, and I pledge that love to you completely." As Reverend Porter pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the small gathering. Hank produced a fiddle from behind the sofa and struck up a lively tune, transforming the solemn ceremony into a celebration. The party continued into the evening, with neighbors dropping by to offer congratulations and share in the simple feast that had been prepared. Elizabeth moved among her guests with a sense of wonder, her hand frequently seeking Samuel's, as if to reassure herself that this new happiness was real. As twilight fell, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the house that was now truly their home. Samuel closed the door behind the last well-wishers, then turned to Elizabeth with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. "Mrs. Dawson," he said softly, using her new name for the first time. "Mr. Dawson," she replied, stepping into his open arms. Their kiss was both a culmination and a beginning, an acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them together, and a promise of the path they would now walk side by side. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of what was now their shared bedroom, Samuel traced lazy patterns on Elizabeth's bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked simply. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, nestling closer to his warmth. "When Thomas died, I thought everything was ending. I never imagined that it could be the start of something so much better." "That's the thing about endings," Samuel observed thoughtfully. "They're really just the soil where new beginnings take root." Elizabeth smiled at the apt metaphor from a man who understood the cycles of nature so well. "Like our land after winter." "Exactly like that," Samuel agreed, kissing her forehead, "and spring is just beginning." The years that followed proved the truth of Samuel's words. Under their joint stewardship, the Norwood Dawson Ranch flourished, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. The irrigation system Samuel had designed transformed previously marginal land into productive fields. while Elizabeth's careful financial management ensured they never overextended as Thomas had done. Their personal happiness grew alongside the ranch's success. A year after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to a son they named James, after Samuel's father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they called Catherine in honor of Elizabeth's mother. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, learning to ride almost before they could walk, developing a love for the land that matched their parents. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Additional land was acquired carefully, each purchase planned and paid for without debt. The original ranch house was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Samuel insisting that Elizabeth have a proper study where she could pursue her writing, a dream she had finally begun to realize, publishing stories about frontier life in Eastern magazines under her maiden name. Silver Reef itself changed with the passing years. The mines eventually played out, causing some businesses to close and people to leave. But unlike many mining towns that became ghosts when the ore was gone, Silver Reef evolved, sustained by the ranches and farms that had taken root in the surrounding countryside. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Elizabeth with a special gift, the deed to a small piece of land at the highest point of their property, where a person could see almost the entire ranch spread out below. There, he had built a simple stone bench beneath a cottonwood tree. For reflection, he explained as they sat together watching the sunset paint the landscape in shades of gold and purple. To remind us how far we've come. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, watching their children playing in the distance near the house. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked. "That day you rode up to offer a partnership to a desperate widow." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "I hoped," he admitted, "but reality has surpassed even my hopes." "Mine too," Elizabeth agreed, turning to kiss him with the same tenderness they had shared on their wedding day, deepened now by years of partnership in every sense of the word. As they made their way back down the hill toward home, Elizabeth paused to look back at the bench silhouetted against the darkening sky. It stood as a testament to what they had built together, not just a successful ranch, but a family, a community, a legacy that would endure beyond their lifetimes. From desperate beginnings, had grown something truly worth keeping, a life built on love, respect, and the shared belief that with hard work and faith, even the most barren land could flourish. And as she took Samuel's hand to continue their journey home, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would have approved. For in the end, his dream had been realized just through a different path than he had imagined, and with a better partner than he could have been. What had begun with debt and death had transformed into abundance and life, a fitting metaphor for the land they loved, and the future they continued to build together, season by season, year by year, one careful decision after another.